As we begin to look at topic number 3, let's look first at the topic of narrative genre distinctives for inductive Bible study. And of course, over the last couple weeks, we've looked at the general guidelines for inductive Bible study, and hopefully you're starting to get familiar with the basic process. And the basic process doesn't change. The 7 steps that we went over are going to be pretty much the same no matter what you're looking at, with a few slight distinctions. How things are done in observation, for example, and interpretation and application, a little bit of differences, and there will be a few differences on some of the other steps, but generally speaking, the same 7 steps. And so now let's look at the distinctions, firstly, for narrative genre. And let's begin with a brief introduction. Now, as Fee and Stewart note in their book, people force incorrect interpretations and applications on narrative portions of the Bible as much as or more than they do on any other parts of the Bible. And I would agree with them. In my personal experience, I've seen many instances, more instances than I can count, of people doing just that, misunderstanding and misapplying the narrative passages of the Bible. And so I think it is absolutely essential that we would understand how to look at narratives appropriately, properly. And I could give you story after story of portions of the scriptures, especially the narratives, that are just completely off base. But I think it's more helpful that we look at how to do it correctly than just how it's been done wrong, although we will look at a couple instances of that as we go along. And so it is important for us to have solid principles to guide our study of the narrative portions of the Bible. So what are narratives? Now, narratives, from Fee and Stewart's book, are stories, purposeful stories retelling the historical events of the past that are intended to give meaning and direction for a given people in the present. And that's from, again, Fee and Stewart's book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, page 90. This is your book that you're supposed to be reading throughout the semester, so make sure you have read that already. Hopefully you have read that already, and that's just a reminder. Now, as we are looking at the narrative genre, let's look first at the narrative books of the Bible and think about which books of the Bible are considered as narrative books. I'm sure this is probably already pretty clear in your mind. We'll just go over this briefly and look through what are the narrative books of the Bible. Now, in my estimation, there are 4 main categories by which we can classify the narrative books of the Old Testament. And maybe some people don't do this, but I think it's helpful to think about, because not all of them are exactly the same. And so I would say that there are 4 main categories, and those categories are, number 1, books that are primarily narrative from the Old Testament, and then number 2, partially narrative, also in the Old Testament. Number 3, primarily narrative books in the New Testament, and then number 4, gospel accounts, which are a unique type of narrative in the New Testament. They're still narrative books, but they're a little bit different than what you would typically have in the Old Testament. So let's continue on by looking at the primarily narrative books of the Old Testament. Now I'm going to look at these and just briefly pop these up on the screen, and then but I think these are pretty obvious to anyone that these are narrative books, so it's no need to really go over them that much. Of course, Genesis, narrative; Joshua, primarily narrative; Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, then you've got 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. I would count that these 10 books are primarily narrative books in the Old Testament. Now, maybe not absolutely everything that's in them is narrative. There might be a few poetry things here and there, especially, you got like a Psalm of David included in the Chronicles and things like that. So it may not be absolutely all narrative, but by and large, it's mostly narrative. And we can look at partially narrative from the Old Testament as well. And now these also would probably be, if you're familiar with these books, you would understand that these are partially narrative. You've got Exodus, which is definitely partially narrative. There's huge portions of Exodus that are laws, that are the giving of the law. And so, for example, Exodus 20, the 10 Commandments, and on through 23. Then you've got chapters 25 through 31. That's all pretty much law. And so it's no surprise probably to you if you're familiar with Exodus. That's a partially narrative Old Testament book. Part of it is the law, part of it is the narrative. Of course, the law is set in the narrative because it happened in the history of Israel. You can't really separate the two. And so as you're going through the book of Exodus, you get to the law when they're there at the mountain of God. And they've come out of Egypt, and they're there at the mountain of God, and God gives them the law, and then it's recounted for us there in Exodus. So that should be no shock. It's a partially narrative book. Numbers as well is a partially narrative book. More than narrative, I would say it's more than Exodus. It's more narrative than Exodus, but there's still large swaths of Numbers that are indeed law, giving of the law, things like that. And so you've got partially narrative, partially law in Numbers. As well, Deuteronomy has large portions that are repetition of the law, although it does have some narrative in there and some recounting of the narrative of that happened in Exodus and Numbers. And so there's a lot of mixture in there as well. There's some narrative, but it's also got other things inside of it. Now, looking at the primarily narrative books of the New Testament, of course, you probably thought of that, Acts. No big guess there. Acts is the main historical narrative book of the New Testament that acts almost just like an Old Testament narrative book. Now, the only distinction is that it happened in the New Testament with the church, whereas all the narratives in the Old Testament are obviously with the nation of Israel. Then you've got the gospel accounts, which of course include Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And no surprise there, those are the gospel accounts, and they're primarily narrative, though they do have a lot of discourses from the Lord Jesus Christ as he speaks and shares with the people in those gospel accounts. And so there's a lot to that. That's why they're on their own. They're a special type of narrative account, because they have a lot of teaching and instructions from the Lord Jesus Christ. But of course, they're set in historical reality because they happened during the life of Jesus while he was on earth. They're not just random sayings that are collected, over thousands of years or whatnot. They're actually from Jesus Christ, who is a real historical person. And so those are the narrative books of the Bible. I'm sure you probably already knew that, but just going over those main four categories. Now let's continue by looking at the steps that we looked at previously and looking at how there may be some differences or some more things that we can share, especially with regards to narratives. Let's begin by looking at Fee and Stewart, at step number 1, which is reading for narratives. And as part of this, I think it's helpful to look at Fee and Stewart's 5 characteristics of a Hebrew narrative, because that's something you're going to be thinking about as you're reading through the narratives. Number 1 to think about is the narrator. Now, the narrator in any book, especially a lot of the Old Testament books, it's kind of like the voice of the person who's giving you the story. And sometimes that comes from the perspective of the Lord. Sometimes it comes from a human author's perspective. And sometimes you can see that if you want to look up an example of that, Deuteronomy 34 verse 9 gives you the narrator's perspective. And oftentimes we'll see that as well when we're looking through the various books. And so that's something that's helpful to think about when you're reading through the scriptures, is the narrator. Who is the narrator in this story? What's the perspective of the narrator? Then you've got of course, God, and then the human author. Then you've got the scenes. And as I was talking about, this sometimes is the stories or the segment level. And a scene has a who, it has a what, it has a where, it has a when. And so you're starting to see these scenes that are going through. For example, in Ruth, in chapter 2, we see that the second scene of chapter 2 is that Ruth she's in the field, and she's with the people of Boaz. Boaz comes, he greets them, finds out about her, talks to her, and then maybe there's a couple sub scenes there where you've got them at lunch, and then she goes back home at the end of the day, or she's talking to Boaz, then she has lunch, and then later on in the day she goes home. But maybe that's generally one scene because it's kind of showing them, during the process of that initial meeting in the gleaning, as she's been gleaning in Boaz's field. And so that's maybe one scene where you've got the same characters. You've got Boaz, you've got Ruth. Those are the main characters, and they're consistent. A little bit of a difference in the what, as you've got, first she's gleaning, then she's at lunch, then she's gleaning again, and then she's going home. But it's generally a lot of this similar things. You've got it's all in one day, although you do have different times of the day. You've got lunchtime, you've got the morning time, you've got lunchtime, and then you've got the time for the threshing out, and then you've got her return journey home. So you've got different times throughout the day, different events, generally a lot of similarities. Of course, the same location. She's at Boaz's field pretty much all day until she comes home to the city to her mother-in-law, Naomi. And so that would be a scene. You might be able to chop that up even smaller into sub-scenes, but that's generally what a scene is. Then you've got the characters, and the characters are really important in the story. Again, we've talked about that a lot with the who, what, where, when, and the who is generally what all these stories are about. Of course, you've got events and you've got places and times, but if you don't have the who, then there's no story. It's not like a Disney story that's all about some kind of animal or something like that. No, you've got the human characters, and that's the major facet, one of the major facets of the story. And so understanding these characters, who is Boaz, who is Ruth, who is Naomi, really understanding all these characters, especially the main ones, is really significant for understanding, especially as you're reading through the narratives. And remembering people as you're reading through the narratives really helps you understand the whole story when you're reading it. You're reading, for example, and you read through the story of David with his mighty men. Actually, when he's king and he's got this guy named Joab, and you don't understand who this Joab guy is. Well, as you're reading through and you understand that this is actually his cousin, and then you find out that Joab's brother, Asahel, dies, and then that's why later on Joab murders the guy who killed his brother Asahel. So there's a lot of complications in some of these stories, but if you remember who the characters are and what interactions they've had with other people, you're going to remember, you're going to get a lot of connections in how these stories go. Then also the dialogue is a significant factor in the Hebrew narrative as you're thinking about how they're talking to each other. And of course, in the book of Ruth, we had an example of that when Ruth is talking to Naomi, and she's really just pouring out her heart, how she wants to stick with Naomi no matter what, and makes all those promises to Naomi, basically converts to Naomi's way of life and also to Naomi's religion, to serving the one true God. So those dialogues are really important as you see the characters interact with each other, especially when it's recorded. If it doesn't record it, probably it wasn't important, but if it's recorded, definitely something about that conversation is significant for us to understand. So the dialogue is also something very important. And then lastly, the plot, which is the overall idea of what's going on in the story, the major turns in the storyline. This person did this, then he did this, then he did this. And so understanding that plot is also significant for the Hebrew narrative, especially as you're reading through the narratives the first time, whatever it is, however many times you've read through the book. When you're reading through it, think about these plot lines. That goes along with the who, what, when, where that we've been talking about a lot. And now looking at step number 2, which is outlining for narratives. I'm going to give some general guidelines for how to outline. You guys have already been doing this in your homework, but I want to give you some general guidelines so that you can be even more efficient. Number one, identify the major divisions during the initial bulk reading. Now, this is something that you can actually do it many different ways. You can start off with the segments, and then after that you can do the sections and then put all those sections into major divisions. That's possible also. But what I've noticed when doing narratives, specifically narratives, is that sometimes it's easier to do the major divisions first once you've read through the entire book. Because once you've read through the entire book, you've kind of gotten that overall idea of what's going on in this book, and so you can make those major divisions easy early on. That's not always the case. In fact, I think, Ruth, it is a little bit easier to start with the segments than it is with the major divisions, but oftentimes for the really big books, it's easier to do major divisions first during that initial bulk reading. And bulk reading is an assignment that will have you read the whole book in one or two sittings, however fast you can read it. Although with the bigger books, sometimes it's a little bit harder to read it through at one sitting, but when you do, and if you're thinking about the major pieces of the book, that'll really help you with your outline during that initial reading. Number two, determine the major divisions according to the narrative type. And we'll actually be talking about the type of narrative for these individual books, whether it's character-driven narratives or event-driven narratives. And so, you're thinking, is this major division focused on a character? And then when the next main character arrives, then it's a different major division? Or is it focused on a type of event, and then that's when the major division change comes into the book? And so it's going to be different depending on the different type of narrative it is. Number three, identify segment divisions according to the 4 W's. Again, like I mentioned, you're going to be thinking about not just the who, but also the what and the where and the when. And that's oftentimes going to help you understand when there's a significant change in segment. Maybe if you've got 3 of the 4 that are consistent, and then just one changes, maybe that's even just a subsegment, whereas maybe it's a change, an actual change, if there's a change in more than just 1 or 2. Or even if there's 2, sometimes it's a change in segment. You might have the same character, maybe even the same what, but a different time in a different place. Let's say they're traveling. Maybe, you're going to find something different when they get to the next location. But generally, if you have more than 1 or 2 even, it will be a change in segment. Number 4, identify sections by grouping together segments with common story elements. And again, the narrative type is a factor here, because you're thinking, are these sections grouped together according to, they're all related to one particular person, and then those events, which are the individual segments underneath the section, those are all going to be events in that person's life. And so you're going to be thinking through that and trying to figure that out as you are outlining. And so when you're outlining, you've got all those segments, and then you're grouping those segments together according to those common story elements. What are the common story elements in this section? Like, for example, I would consider that all of chapter 2 is a common story. Or common stories, I should say, multiple stories that have a common element. In the beginning, the first several verses of chapter 2, you've got Ruth going out talking to her mother about going out to the field, and then you've got the middle portion about Ruth being in the field and interacting with Boaz during that time. And then the last several verses, you've got Ruth being at home with Naomi. And then in that case, then you've got a different thing altogether. So the first segment would be Naomi and Ruth are the main characters, and it's before she's actually gone out to the field. She's talking about going out to the field. Then you've got the main character after that being Boaz and Ruth, and they're together during one day, although there's different portions of that day, so it's still kind of the same scene, so I'd consider that a segment. And then you've got the final one, which is where Ruth goes home to her mother, and she gives her the grain that she's gotten and tells her all about how she met Boaz, and it's just really encouraging, I'm sure, to Naomi, because she realizes that it's the possible kinsman redeemer, as is such according to the practice of the Israelites. And so that whole chapter can really be described as kind of a section that has several different segments that are related by common story elements. And the common story element is the meeting of Boaz and Ruth in the fields for gleaning, as Ruth is gleaning. So a meeting of Boaz and Ruth in the fields of Bethlehem. You could even call it that as a section, as you're grouping those segments together. They're all related according to the fact that Naomi is gleaning in a field that happens to be Boaz, and the surrounding events. The going out to do that, the doing of that, and then the coming back and reporting to Naomi of what she did. It's all related to the gleaning in the fields. And so identify sections by grouping together segments with common story elements. And this is, really when you're thinking about narratives, you're thinking about what story is going on here, and then thinking about how you can group those segments, those individual little stories, together as they are related to one another. Number 5, include as many of the 4 W's in your titles as possible, because when you are doing the segment title in your outline, you're going to want to include as many details as possible without making it overburdening. You don't want it to be 5 sentences long. It should be probably less than a sentence. As much as you can, you want to get it down in, as pithy a phrase as possible. But at the same time, you're going to want to make sure that it has enough content that when you look back and you've forgotten what the book is about, or at least, that portion, that you can see that title and it'll remind you exactly what's going on in that segment. That's what the purpose of your titles are, to help you understand the book in just that broad scope of having the outline. Next, let's continue looking at outline for narratives, and let's look at narrative types. And this is something that I've kind of put together as I look at the narratives and see different types of narratives. That is, they've got different focuses. And so the first one is a character-driven narrative. And you can see examples of that in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Of course, in 1st and 2nd Samuel, you've got the characters of Samuel, then Saul, then David, and sometimes you've got portions that are a mixture between Saul and David. When you've got 1st and 2nd Kings, you've got David, Samuel, Elijah, Elisha, the kings of Israel, and also the kings of Judah. And that's all, those are all, it's really the whole book revolves around the characters, not so much the events. Of course, there are events, but it revolves more about the characters, and each character has multiple events that are in their lives. Also with Chronicles, you've got first starting out with genealogies, which is all the people of Israel going back to the time of Adam, actually, in the book of Chronicles. Then you've got Saul, then you've got David, then you've got Solomon, and then you've got, of course, the kings of Judah, because Chronicles doesn't include any of the kings of Israel, of northern Israel. Then you've got event-driven narratives that are focused more about the events than they are focused about the people in the events, although the people are still there, but it's more event-driven. Of course, an example of this would be the Exodus, which is, first of all, you've got deliverance from Egypt, then you've got the journey to the mountain of God, then you've got Israel at the mountain of God. Now, of course, Moses is a main character in that book, but it seems to me that it's more event-driven than it is character-driven. Numbers as well is about the whole nation of Israel, but it's about the happenings, the events, as they are there in the wilderness and going towards the promised land. And of course, the book of Numbers covers ultimately 40 years. So you've got preparation for the journey, you've got rejection of the promised land as they're there ready to take it, but then they reject it. You remember the story with the 12 spies. Then you've got how they wandered in the wilderness, and that's in the middle portion of the book, chapters 12 through 15, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. Then you've got the positioning before the promised land, where they're coming into the land of Moab and they're positioning and ready to take the promised land. Then you've got the book of Joshua, which first of all, it talks about the securing of Joshua, then it talks about the invasion of the promised land, then the division of the promised land, and then the spiritual securing of Israel at the latter portion of the book of Joshua, as he's trying to help them follow the Lord even after his departure. And so it's pretty much, of course, the whole book is about Joshua, but really, when you look at the major divisions in the book, it's mostly event-driven. Then you've got, of course, Ruth, and Ruth, I would say, is also event-driven. I'll go over with you my outline in another video, but I think that it is event-driven. I would say that chapter 1 is the tragedy. And not always do outlines match up with the chapters, but in this case it seems to. Chapter 1 is the tragedy. Chapter 2 to 3 is glimpses of hope, and chapter 4 is the redemption. Ezra is another example of an event-driven narrative. And this one, you've got the first 6 chapters is physical restoration, and then the last several chapters, 7 through 10, is spiritual restoration. Although as well in there, you also have a time difference between the beginning of the book of Ezra and the latter portion of the book of Ezra. Actually, quite a significant time difference, but that's for another time. Then you've got Nehemiah, which is chapters 1 through 7 is physical restoration. Chapters 8 through 12 is spiritual restoration. So really there's a distinction between the events that are going on, the major events going on in the book of Nehemiah. Of course, it's named after Nehemiah. Nehemiah's there, but it's not only about Nehemiah. It's about the events that the Lord is able to work through the life of Nehemiah. Lastly, you've got what I call mixed focus narratives, and in this one, you've got a mixture of event focus and character-driven focus. And so I've got Genesis. That one, a lot of people would say the beginning portions of the book of Genesis are focused on more of the events, the creation, the fall, the flood, the scattering, and then the latter portion, starting in chapter 12, is all about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then also Joseph as well. And then you've got the book of Judges. The book of Judges, I would also say, is mixed focus. And this one speaks of the failures of the Israelites initially, and then it talks about the judges of Israel, which is, they are characters. And so you've got portions that are about events and portions that are about characters. And then the final portion from chapter 17 through 21 is stories from the time of the judges. And so that's really actually more than just character focuses, it's event focuses, because it gives a couple of events that happened during the time of the judges that really give you kind of character of what it was like during that time. So it's called that a mixed focused narrative. Sometimes it's about the people, sometimes it's about the events, and so you have different types of narrative types, and it's important when you're thinking about the major divisions that you're going to create, if you're going to be outlining, that you would think about what kind of a book it is. What's the main focus of the book? Is it about events or is it about characters? And if it's about events, then it's going to have events as the major divisions. If it's characters, it's going to have characters as the major divisions. And so understanding the type of narrative helps you with figuring out the major divisions of the book. Next, let's continue in step number 3, which is background for narratives. Now, as I mentioned before, there's only a few aspects of backgrounds, and for narratives, it's relatively simple. You've usually got the book author and then also the date. And if you're looking at, for example, the book of Ruth, the author traditionally for the book of Ruth, which there's no author given inside the book of Ruth, so we have to look outside of it, and to tradition is one of those places. And the author of this book traditionally was Samuel, who was the last of the judges and the first of the major prophets during the transition to the King's period. That actually I got from New Bible Dictionary. That's one of the places that I like to go for external information, is New Bible Dictionary. Now, Samuel actually anointed both Saul and David in his role as the Lord's prophet, and that would seem to match with what we can see from inside the book of Ruth, since we know from the inclusion of David in the ending genealogy of Ruth chapter 4, verses 18 through 22, that in fact David was known by the author of the book of Ruth. So it had to have been written after David was already alive and probably already the king at that point. Now, if this book was indeed written by Samuel, then the date would have been sometime after 1025 BC, which is the date of the anointing of King David, and that's according to the Zondervan Atlas of the Bible. You can find that on page 131 if you're interested in reading more about that, and if you're taking our other class, you'll also go through that as well if you're taking Geography and History of Biblical Lands. Now, the purpose is, secondly, sometimes there is a purpose in this story. And, of course, this is a wonderful story about the Lord's redemption of those in need. And that could be one of the purposes that we see the Lord's redemption, even out of the worst issues and times in our life. Yet, at the same time, it's also possible that this functions as something of a background story for King David. That might have been another possible purpose that the Lord had in bringing this story around, because we learn more about King David. Now, one could imagine that this story was written down to explain the interesting history of David's family, especially as they're partially of Moabite descent. And so understanding that is significant. Now, other information you can find out, for example, the book of Ruth, and we kind of learned this in the first topic that we had in this class. Ruth was one of the 5 books called the Megilloth in the Hebrew canon and was read annually by the Jews at the Feast of Weeks. And so you can look up that more if you'd like. That, for example, I got that information also from New Bible Dictionary, on the article Ruth, the book of Ruth. And so if you want to look that up more, you're welcome to. There's a lot more information you can find out, but that's just an example of that kind of information. Then afterwards, I would give a general overview of the book just to get out the basic information of what the book has in it. What's the main story of the book? So that would be the last part of the background for narratives. Now, step number 4 is observation lists for narratives. Now, in this one, we talked about this before. Actually, I called it significant words before. And in the New Testament, oftentimes it's significant word in a lot of parts of the Bible. But here in the Old Testament narratives, oftentimes it's what I will call observation lists, where you just pick out things that are very significant to look at and understand. And so, for example, messianic prophecies in the Old Testament, this is very significant to have a list as you're going through a book of the messianic prophecies. Now, that might not be always super significant because, like, for example, the book of Ruth doesn't have any messianic prophecies, but a lot of books will have, and some in the narratives will also have messianic prophecies as well. Now, also, you're going to need to think about fulfilled prophecies. If you're looking at one of the Gospels, that's also a significant observation list to have when you're going through the Gospel accounts. What are the fulfilled prophecies that we see in the Gospels account? And, of course, there are a lot in the Gospel accounts. Number 3, Old Testament references, and this would be for the New Testament in general, both in the Gospels, and sometimes it's overlapping with the fulfilled prophecies. It's an Old Testament reference, but sometimes there's other Old Testament references that aren't necessarily a fulfilled prophecy or something like that. You can see that a lot in the book of Acts as well. Now, step number 5 Actually, it should say step number 5, but step number 5 is observation lists for narratives. So now number 1, or actually observation for narratives, that's the previous step. It should say step number 5 up there. It says number 4. Now let's look at in-depth first. Now, as we learned before, the first rule is observe everything in the text. Now, you might not think it's as important in narrative portions of the Bible, but it's still important. And you might not understand everything or think everything is that significant. But if you want to understand the full idea of the story and you're doing an in-depth, then you're going to need to see everything in the text. Although you might not need to break it down as deep. And that brings us to the second rule, which is observe phrase by phrase, not simply verse by verse. Sometimes in the narratives, because there's not a whole lot that's being said, it can be verse by verse and not phrase by phrase. But again, it depends on the contents of the text. If there's a lot going on, if there's not a lot going on, well then, of course, judge it as you will. But of course, you're responsible for the Lord of how well you understand his word. And so if it's necessary to understand, then break it down phrase by phrase. If it's not, if it's one whole thought, then you can go ahead and do verse by verse if that's the case, especially for narratives. Now, lastly, observe individual words according to importance. Of course, in the narratives, oftentimes this will be a character. Do you need to say, hey, who is this character, and separate that off by themselves? And, okay, let me explain this character before I explain the whole phrase or verse in which this character is found, because maybe you need to give a little bit of background about who this person is, or maybe about a country. When it says that they're going off to Moab, maybe you need to separate that off by itself and explain who in the world Moab is, and what's the history of Israel with Moab. And that will give us some interesting ideas, especially about how desperate Elimelech was to take his family to the Moab, who were, for all intents and purposes, enemies all throughout their history in Israel. Now, looking at the survey side, this is again the same rules that we saw before, but it's observe the passage according to key verses or phrases. And just as I said before, you're going to want to identify the key verses or phrases by the main who, the main what, the main where, and the main when. Now, looking at interpretation for narratives, which is number 6. And I would say that there are 3 important guidelines that we should be thinking about. Of course, in the book that you're supposed to be reading from Gordon and from Fee and Stewart, Gordon Fee and Stewart. If you've read that book, you've seen he has a long list at the end of his chapter on understanding narratives, and I would say read that and understand that and think about those. That's good. That's great. I just want to focus on 3 in this lecture because I think that these 3 are very important. Now, number 1 is biblical narratives are true stories. I'm going to explain this in just a second. Let me just put down these 3 first. Narratives are not given for allegorical purposes. And then number 3, narrative lessons must be understood contextually. Okay, so those are the 3, and I want to break that down piece by piece and look at each one of those individually. Number 1, narratives are true stories. Now, one thing that is really important for us to understand is that the narratives of the Bible are not fictional stories or even historical fiction. Historical fiction would be where you're telling a true story, but you're inserting a fake character into it. For example, if that was the case, then maybe the story of Canaan and all that's true, but Abraham's a fake character inside the land of Canaan. Well, that's not what the Bible declares to be true about the narratives of the Old Testament or any of the Bible. It's not a historical fiction. It's not a fictional stories. It's real, true stories, and all the characters are real and true. There's nothing fake about it. There's nothing fictitious about it. Now, this is important. I can give you an illustration about why this is important, that we would clarify this in our mind through how I used to tell stories to my children. And I used to I still do tell my kids stories before they go to sleep. And sometimes I'll make up made up stories. And usually when my firstborn son, I would make up a lot of fanciful stories. I'd ask him, hey, give me two animals, and I'd make up a story about those two animals, right? But then sometimes I would share with him stories about what Jesus did on earth. Unfortunately, my oldest son, when back in the day, he got confused and thought that even the stories about Jesus were just made up by daddy. He didn't realize they were true stories. Now I'm very careful to clarify for my kids when I'm telling them, fake stories about a lion and a giraffe or whatnot. I always make up fun stories like that. I'm careful to let them know that that's just a fake story. It's not a real story. But then when I talk about Jesus, I'll let them know this is a real, true story. This actually happened. It's not a fake story. Daddy's not just making it up. This is a real, true story. And so that's that's a illustration of why that's important, because they might, if we don't, if that's not conscious in our mind and we're not letting people know that, people might think, oh, these are just, fairy tales. But no, they're not fairy tales. The primary thing that we need to show is that what we have in the scriptures is rooted in fact. Now, this is true in spite of the critics who have come along over the years, as the Bible has always been proven to be true. I guess I forgot to put that on the screen. The narratives of the Bible are not fictional stories or even historical fiction. And one way that we can take an example of, or one story that we can take an example of, is the biblical story of Jericho, and especially of the Israelites marching around the city until the walls fell down. Do you remember that story? Now, have you ever wondered whether that really happened? Whether that story of Jericho really happened? Well, that's one thing that we believe. The Bible is not telling fake stories. It's telling real, true stories. Now, this story is always told in Sunday school, and one might wonder if it's true or a fictionalized story. Well, just to give you some further evidence, in archaeology, the ancient city of Jericho has been found, and its wall was almost completely fallen down toward the outside, which would have made a perfect ramp for the Israelites to climb up into the city, since it was on a hill. You can see that there in the picture on the right, and that's the hill of Jericho, and there's a wall around it. You can't see it obviously now anymore. They've excavated parts of it, but they haven't taken all the dirt off of the entire mound, because that takes a lot of money, a lot of people to dig. You can't just get a bulldozer in there and bulldoze, or else you'll ruin the whatever's underneath. And so it takes a long time. But they have gone in there and dug excavations in various portions on the mound of ancient Jericho. And what they found out is that, in fact, it did fall down just as it says. And now I purposely mentioned that it almost completely fell down, because it didn't fully fall down. And you might remember why that is if you remember the story, how there was a particular person who was living in the wall. And so this matches up perfectly with the preservation of Rahab and her family, who lived in a house on the wall. In fact, that's how she set free how she helped the spies escape, because she was living on the wall. She was able to help them down out through the window in her wall. And so we see that it matches up perfectly with what the biblical story says. Now, ultimately, the narratives of the Bible are presented as true, historical fact in the Bible, and archaeological discoveries have only proven that to be true. And there's actually never been something that's been proven to be untrue when you look at the archaeological discoveries. So sometimes people would accuse the Bible of being wrong because they haven't dug enough in the dirt and found enough evidence. But once they do, then they start proving that the Bible is right and we are wrong about this. And I could give you example after example about that one, but that's something that's really important for us to remember. Biblical narratives are true stories. Whatever else they are, however else they help us understand the Lord, they are true stories. Now, next, narratives are not given for allegorical purposes. Do you know what an allegory is? An allegory is a story that you tell where each of the parts means something else beyond its literal meaning. And so you're telling it, but it's got all this significance behind it, and you're always trying to dig and figure out, oh, what's this represent? This represents this, and this represents this. Well, the narratives of the Bible are not given for allegorical purposes. Now, Gordon Fee points this out in his book that these Bible stories should not be taken as allegories or stories filled with hidden meaning. Now, that's you can look that up in page 92 of the book that is for that we're using for this course. Now, I've over the years read many assignments of students, even in this Bible college, in which they allegorize and spiritualize the texts that they are interpreting, and in doing so, they miss the fact that these are real stories in real history, and that's not what the narrative books of the Bible, the narrative passages of the Bible were given for, so that we could turn it into some kind of a spiritualized story. I've seen so many examples of that. Like, for example, David and Goliath. David gets 5 smooth stones, and that's some kind of an allegory, spiritual allegory. I'm like, come on. Or even another one, David and Goliath, is that David is, represents Jesus and Goliath represents Satan or something like that. No, that's a terrible analogy. It represents a real man who's fighting for God against the enemies of God. And through that real situation, we can learn to trust in God just as David trusted in God. But again, we'll get to that in a second when we talk about how we can understand these passages. Now, one such instance of an incorrect interpretation that I want to give you a little bit more focus is Augustine's allegory of John 11. And if you don't know who Augustine is, he's one of the early Latin church fathers, and he came around the time when the church was going from its New Testament time period into its more Catholic time period. Wouldn't be officially seen as that for a little while, but that was the beginning of it during that period. And so Augustine had this allegory of John 11. They were really into this back in this time, and that's why sometimes reading the church fathers is not very helpful, because their commentaries on the scripture sometimes have some really weird things, at least in this portion. If you go back to the ones that are just after Jesus, they're fine. But if you get into this, 300 years later, it's you get a little bit of weird interpretations. Now, in Augustine's interpretation, he would say that this is an allegory of the spiritual deadness and resurrection of man expressed in 4 levels through the 4 days that Lazarus was dead, and then the spiritual resurrection that God gives. And so there's this is actually Augustine in his commentary on John 11. It literally says just that. He says, these 4 days represent the 4 levels of the spiritual deadness of man. That's not what it's talking about. Not at all. Not only does this not match with the story of Lazarus, it also completely loses the real historical reality and purpose of the story of Lazarus. Now, if we were to give the story of John 11 an overall correct interpretation, we would say that resurrection... It's about resurrection, not about physical resurrection. The resurrection of Lazarus is not an allegory for spiritual resurrection, but a manifestation of Jesus' ability to give life to those who physically died. Think about what Jesus did. He raised a man physically from the dead. That's about Jesus' power to raise people in reality. We're not talking about some allegory. We're talking about Jesus has the real power to raise people who have physically died. And that is so amazing, because then we can trust in him. In fact, this is part of what he was talking to Martha about, where Martha is... talking about, I know that in the final day, resurrection, he's going to live. Well, Jesus is going to show him that Jesus was showing Martha and those people around that he in fact is the resurrection and the life. And so this is a manifestation of Jesus' ability to give life to those who have physically died. And that's something that we really, really need to understand well. Now that brings up a very important point. How and what can we learn of these stories of people who have long been dead? And so let's think about how we must understand narrative lessons. And so narrative lessons must be understood contextually. Now, while narratives are not always given for the express purpose of teaching a lesson, yet we can always draw lessons out of these stories when we look at what the rest of the scriptures say, especially about the actions, characteristics, or attitudes that we see in those stories, both about man and about God. Now, often the Bible will recount a real historical story without any commentary on the morality of the actions taken in the story. For example, let me give you the example, the lies of Jacob in Genesis chapter 27. Let me read this really quick in verses 17 through 19. It says, "Then she gave the savory food and the bread," this is Rebekah, the mother of Jacob, which she had prepared, into the hand of her son Jacob. Verse 18, "So he went to his father and said, 'My father.' And he said, 'Here I am.' 'Who are you, my son?' Jacob said to his father, 'I'm Esau, your firstborn.'" And, he's probably trying to make his voice deeper because Esau was a gruff man. "I've done just as you told me. Please arise, sit and eat of my game, that your soul may bless me." And of course, it goes on further with with Jacob, deceiving his father, and his father even saying, "Hey, you don't sound like my son. You feel like him," because he had put actually goat hair on his arm. That was part of what Rebekah had told him to do, put the goat hair on his arm. So if his father felt him, because his father was almost blind, he couldn't see who it was, then he would feel like Esau, even though the voice wasn't really perfect. And so he lied to his father. And so in the immediate passage, we are not told that the deeds of Jacob and Rebekah are wicked. Now, we can kind of discern that from the fact that it causes so much chaos in their family at that time, but we're not initially told by the narrator, if you will, because remember, how you're reading through the passage, we're not told by the narrator that the deeds are wicked. But when we consider the moral teachings of the Old and New Testament, it becomes clear that lying is a sin. And so we can interpret the lies of Jacob and Rebekah as being sin and as a moral flaw that we should avoid. Thinking back, God had promised that Jacob would receive the greatest portion. And that was not something that Rebekah and Jacob needed to get to by lies. But unfortunately they did, just as many of the ancient people did. Abraham lied several times, unfortunately. Isaac lied several times, unfortunately. It never turned out good. But these lies, sometimes they don't have enough moral fortitude to do it in the right way. And so they, because Rebekah could have gone to Jacob and said, "Hey, God gave me this prophecy before. What are you doing? Why are you favoring Esau when you should be favoring Jacob?" But she didn't. She didn't talk to her husband. She just tried to deceive him. And so we have to search the teachings of the scriptures if we want to know the morality of the actions and experience that happened in the historical accounts of the narratives. Another example I could give you is, for example, in the marrying of the sons of Naomi to the women of Moab. And you could say, well, is that wicked or is that right? And initially, when you look to the moral teachings of the Old Testament, especially to the law, which they would have been under during the time of the judges, it tells them that they're not supposed to marry women of various certain tribes, and that's probably extended to Moab, just because of the fact that the heart behind that law was not just that they wouldn't marry only those, what if some other tribe popped up that wasn't of God? Well, it was mainly about keeping them away from having a woman influence them in their life away from God. And if you had an unbeliever from a different nation who didn't believe in your God, of course that's what's going to happen. She's going to lead you astray to these other gods. And so that's when we think about that, then we realize, oh, hey, they probably sinned when they married Ruth and Orpah. Now, it worked out later on, well, not really worked out, but later on, as life went on, Ruth decided to actually convert and to be part of not only the people of Naomi, but also the spiritual heritage of Naomi's people. And so we see that it worked out eventually, but it wasn't something that was right initially. The Lord, though, has the ability to redeem even the worst of situations. Now, for now, just remember that these are real stories that often do not include teaching, but that can teach us real lessons if we're willing to pay attention. Another passage you could look at is Romans chapter 15, verse 4. Again, that's Romans chapter 15, verse 4. Now, lastly, let's look at step number 7, which is application for narratives. And again, this is going to be very much the same as before. I'll just give you a short reminder of this. Number 1, apply the scriptures according to your given interpretation. Again, the scriptures according to your given interpretation, it must match your interpretation from somewhere in the passage. You're looking at somewhere in the passage and you're applying that interpretation. Remember, in the interpretation, you've done the hard work of bringing it into context, not only inside the context of their time, but also according to the New Testament context as well. And now you're going to base your application upon that interpretation. It should be according to those interpretations, and then you can carry it forth more to how that works out in your life, but it's based on the solid interpretation of the scripture, so it should be related to somewhere your interpretation in your text, not just something random you pull out that you never talked about before anywhere in the passages. Number 2, apply the scriptures according to our new covenant in Christ. And of course, this is we need to remember that when we're applying the scriptures, it might not always apply initially the same way for us. Like if we see Abraham making sacrifices to the Lord, your application is not to, I'm going to go make some sacrifices to the Lord, because of course Jesus Christ already is our sacrifice, so no need to make additional sacrifices. So this is something that we need to think about. How does it apply according to our new covenant in Christ? Now, maybe sometimes it'll be the same. The morality of it might be the same. For example, lying. We see Jacob lying and we say, hey, lying's not good. This is wrong. And this is wrong in the Old Testament. And then in the New Testament, we know it's also wrong. We've already seen that in interpretation. And so now we say, you know what? I'm not going to lie anymore. I've been lying to this person, but I'm not going to lie anymore, whatever it may be in your life as you start to apply the scriptures to your life. Now, again, apply the scriptures in a personal way, and this is for your personal notebook, and so only you and the teacher are going to see this, and you should make it personal to your life. What's going on in your life? How's the Lord telling you you need to change your life? Don't include other people inside the application. Talking about other people, not talking about other people, but referencing generally people in general is fine in the interpretation, but in the application, it should be about you. You should be saying, in my life, I need to change this about the way I do things, or whatever it may be. It's not about other people when it comes to applying the scriptures. It should be done in a personal way. Now, also in a specific way. Don't be vague with generalities. Well, I need to do something more that pleases God in life. Yeah, that's so general. Be very more specific. What is it that God is specifically telling you that needs to change? Maybe there's a specific action that you've been doing, and God's saying, hey, you need to cut it out. Now, lastly, apply the scriptures in a practical way. Think about how to actually do what you've been called to do. Think about how to accomplish that in a very real, practical way. And remember, don't try and say, well, I'm going to read my Bible 20 times a day and I'm going to do that. Think practically. How does the Lord want you to put this into practical application as much as you can now? And so those are the applications for narratives. Again, if you need to, go ahead and look at all of this stuff over again, and then work your way through this content.